The bitter wind, a razor's edge honed on the endless steps, tore at the tattered wool of Sergeant Major Klaus Richter's greatcoat. It was January 23rd, 1943, a date etched into the fabric of his mind with the cold, hard clarity of a surgeon's scalpel. The air itself seemed to crackle with a preternatural stillness, a pregnant pause before the storm he knew was coming. He stood on the shattered ramparts of what had once been a grain elevator, a skeletal monument to industry now reduced to rubble and ice. Below, the Volga, a ribbon of frozen steel, lay silent, a stark contrast to the inferno that had raged across its banks for months. Richter squinted, his eyes, accustomed to the gray pallor of winter, scanning the desolate landscape. Snow, thick and unforgiving, blanketed the ruins of Stalingrad, muffling the usual cacophony of war. Yet beneath the quiet, a primal tension hummed, a discordant symphony of fear and defiance. He could feel it in the ache of his bones, the gnawing emptiness in his gut, the ever-present odor of cordite and decay that clung to everything like a shroud. Just hours ago, the crackling static of the radio had delivered the Führer's pronouncement. Festung Stalingrad! Fortress Stalingrad. Hold at all costs. No surrender. No retreat. The words, delivered with chilling finality by the Führer himself, had echoed through the frozen dugouts and shattered buildings, met with a mixture of grim determination and unspoken dread. Hold what? Richter thought, a bitter laugh catching in his throat. Hold these frozen charnel houses? Hold this graveyard of shattered dreams and broken bodies? He ran a gloved hand over the rough, icy concrete of the grain elevator. His men, what was left of them, shivered in their foxholes, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollowed by exhaustion and the relentless gnawing of hunger. Young Corporal Schmidt, barely 18, was huddled nearby, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. His knuckles were white where he gripped his rifle, his gaze fixed on the frozen river, as if willing an enemy that was already within to simply melt away. Anything, Sergeant Major? Schmidt's voice was a reedy whisper, barely audible above the wind's mournful howl. Richter shook his head, the movement stiff and weary. Nothing. Just the wind, boy. Just the damn wind. He didn't tell Schmidt what he truly felt. He didn't tell him about the gnawing certainty that the order, so grandly delivered, was already a ghost of a command, a decree issued from a world far removed from the icy reality of their predicament. The truth, a brutal, unvarnished thing, was that Festung Stalingrad was no longer a fortress. It was a trap. The Soviets, their elusive enemy, had not been content to merely chip away at the edges. They had, with a cunning that bordered on the supernatural, burrowed deep into the heart of the city. They were not outside, waiting to be repelled. They were inside. A venomous serpent coiled around their exhausted, starving army. Richter remembered the whispers, the hushed conversations in the dark, the growing unease that had permeated their ranks for weeks, the constant probing attacks, the sudden disappearances of patrols, the unnerving silence that sometimes fell over sectors where the enemy had been. It wasn't just attrition, it was infiltration. It was a creeping, insidious takeover. He thought of Captain Müller, a man who had always exuded an almost arrogant confidence, his chest puffed out, his voice booming with pronouncements of victory. Müller had dismissed the rumors as fear-mongering, as the desperate imaginings of men pushed to their breaking point. But even Müller's bravado had begun to fray at the edges, replaced by a flicker of doubt in his usually steely eyes. Now, the Führer's order felt like a cruel joke. Hold. How could they hold when the enemy was already in their midst, striking from the shadows, cutting off their supply lines, sowing chaos and despair? The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice, a higher-ranking officer, his tone strained. He spoke of a new offensive, of reinforcing the perimeter, of tightening the noose. Reinforcing what? Richter scoffed internally. The noose was already around their necks. He looked at Schmidt again. The boy's eyes were wide, a mixture of fear and a desperate hope that the sergeant major would offer some word of reassurance, some glimmer of a plan. Richter felt a pang of guilt, a heavy, crushing weight. He was their leader, their protector, their last bastion against the encroaching darkness. But what could he offer? Empty promises? False hope? "We hold, Schmidt," Richter said, his voice rough, trying to inject a confidence he didn't feel. "We hold for the fatherland. We hold for Germany." His words felt hollow, like pebbles tossed into an abyss. Schmidt nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, but a subtle shift had occurred. The desperate hope had receded, replaced by a grim resignation. He understood, Richter knew, that holding now meant something far more terrifying than a frontal assault. It meant fighting an enemy that could appear from anywhere, at any time, in the labyrinthine ruins of their own making. The wind picked up, whipping snow into a blinding frenzy. It felt like the breath of the dead, a chilling reminder of the thousands who had already perished in this frozen hell. Richter pulled his collar tighter, the rough wool scratching against his chin. The order had been given. Fortress Stalingrad. But the Soviets were already inside. The battle for the city had, in reality, already been lost. The fight now was for survival, for a few more agonizing hours in this frozen tomb. And the chilling realization was that the Führer, safely ensconced in his distant headquarters, had no idea of the true horror that had befallen his men. The fortress had already fallen, from the inside out. He turned his back to the wind, his gaze sweeping over the shattered landscape. He saw the skeletal remains of buildings, the frozen husks of tanks, the ghostly outlines of trenches. And within that desolation, he imagined the silent, unseen movements of the enemy, their eyes glinting in the perpetual twilight, their footsteps muffled by the snow. They were the ghosts of Stalingrad, and they had come to claim their prize. The Führer's order was a death knell, not a battle cry, and the silence that followed was not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of surrender, a surrender that had already begun in the deepest, darkest corners of the city. The icy grip of January 23, 1943, tightened its hold, and Klaus Richter knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the real war for Stalingrad had already been lost. The fight to hold the idea of a fortress was about to collide with the brutal reality of a city already conquered from within. The radio squawked again, a burst of static followed by a terse, clipped voice. It was a report from Sector Gamma, an area Richter knew intimately, a collection of bombed-out apartment blocks that had been fiercely contested for weeks. The voice was panicked, fragmented. Heavy machine gun fire from the cellar. We can't see. They're everywhere." The transmission cut out abruptly, leaving only the hiss of static and the mournful cry of the wind. Richter's heart hammered against his ribs. Sector Gamma. That was where Lieutenant Hans Vogel and his company had been dug in, holding a crucial intersection. Vogel, a young man with a fierce loyalty and a surprisingly sharp mind for tactics, had been one of the few sources of reliable information Richter had. If Vogel's men were being overwhelmed, if they couldn't even see their enemy. He looked at Schmidt, his expression grim. "Get the men ready. We're moving out." Schmidt's eyes widened, a flicker of alarm in their depths. "Moving out, Sergeant Major? Where?" "Sector Gamma. We're going to see what's happening." Richter's voice was tight, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let his men be picked off in isolation. If the Soviets were truly inside, they needed to be dealt with, not ignored by a distant, deluded command. As the men, a ragged dozen or so, began to stir, their movements slow and stiff with cold and exhaustion, Richter felt a surge of something akin to defiance. The Führer had ordered them to hold a fortress, but if the fortress was already breached, then their duty, their only hope, was to fight their way out, to understand the true nature of the enemy that had so expertly infiltrated their lines. He grabbed his rifle, its metal icy against his bare hands. He checked the bolt, the familiar click a small comfort in the overwhelming uncertainty. The snow continued to fall, a silent, relentless curtain. He could feel the weight of the order, the impossible burden of Festung Stalingrad. But beneath it, a new imperative was forming. It wasn't about holding a fortress anymore. It was about surviving the enemy that was already within, the unseen foe that had turned their vaunted defenses into a death trap. The dawn was hours away, a distant promise in the perpetual gloom of the Russian winter, and Klaus Richter knew that the coming hours would be a desperate fight, not just for their lives, but for the very truth of their situation. A truth that the Führer, in his grand pronouncements, seemed determined to ignore. The ice was not just on the ground. It was in the hearts of the men, a fear that whispered of an enemy that was not just at the gates, but already inside, feasting on their hopes. The pronouncement from Berlin, crackling with an almost supernatural arrogance through the field telephone, had landed like a shard of ice in Klaus Richter's gut. Festung Stalingrad. Fortress Stalingrad. The words themselves felt like a cruel joke, a gaudy banner draped over a charnel house. He stood on what had once been the roof of a grain elevator, the wind, a razor's edge honed on the endless steps, whipping at his tattered greatcoat. Below, the city was a skeletal monument, a graveyard of shattered dreams and frozen steel. He knew, with a gnawing certainty that burrowed deep into his bones, that the fortress had already fallen. Not to a frontal assault, not to a grand siege, but through a subtle, insidious takeover. The Soviets, those elusive ghosts, had burrowed their way inside, their cunning bordering on the supernatural. They were the venomous serpent coiled within the very heart of their vaunted defenses. The transmission from Lieutenant Vogel's position in Sector Gamma was a chilling testament to this grim reality. "Heavy fire, Sergeant Major," Vogel's reedy whisper had crackled, faint through the static. "Unable to identify targets. They're everywhere, coming from the buildings, the cellars." The words had choked off, replaced by a cacophony of distant, muffled explosions and the sharp staccato burst of what sounded like a machine gun, too close for comfort. Vogel's company, a vital cog in their crumbling perimeter, was being systematically dismantled, not by an enemy on the outside, but by an enemy that had already breached the inner sanctum. Corporal Schmidt, his gaunt face etched with a weariness that transcended his 19 years, stood a few paces away, his breath pluming white in the frigid air. His hollowed eyes, usually fixed on the distant promise of a Russian advance, now darted nervously towards the direction of Vogel's last transmission. He clutched his rifle like a lifeline, the rough wool of his uniform scratching against his skin, offering scant protection against the preternatural cold. He didn't need to ask what the order meant. He felt it too, the primal tension humming in the air, the unspoken dread that clung to everything like a shroud. "We move to Sector Gamma," Richter stated, each word clipped and deliberate, a stark counterpoint to the wind's mournful howl. There was no bravado in his voice, only the grim determination of a man facing an impossible burden. The idea of a fortress was a lie, a delusion peddled by men who saw the war through maps and pronouncements, not through the frozen mud and the dying eyes of their soldiers. He was responsible for the men under his command, and that responsibility now superseded any grand pronouncements from Berlin. Schmidt's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something akin to relief. He nodded, a jerky, almost imperceptible movement. He understood. They were not going to die waiting for orders that defied the icy reality of their situation. They were going to fight. "Gather the men," Richter continued, his voice a low rumble that barely cut through the wind. "The ones who can still walk. We take what ammunition we have, what grenades, and we move. Fast." He didn't mention the near impossibility of the task. They were a handful of weary, half-starved men against an enemy that had already woven itself into the fabric of the city. But the alternative was to wait, to be picked off one by one, to become just another statistic in the Führer's grand, misguided strategy. As Schmidt scurried off, his movements stiff and weary, Richter scanned the desolate landscape. The ruins of Stalingrad stretched out before him, a labyrinthine maze of shattered ramparts and ice-choked rubble. The sky was a perpetual, oppressive gray. The sun a distant, impotent disk offering no warmth. He thought of Lieutenant Vogel, a good officer, sharp and fiercely loyal. He pictured his men, huddled in their frozen dugouts, their breath pluming white as they strained to hear the enemy's approach, only to be met by an unseen foe emerging from the very stones of the city. The silence, when it fell, was more unnerving than the wind. It was a thick, unnatural stillness, a pregnant pause before a storm that had already begun. He could almost hear the Soviets, their movements muffled by the snow, their presence a creeping dread that had tightened the noose around their necks. They were not an army marching. They were shadows, sowing chaos and despair from within. Richter reached into his greatcoat, his gloved fingers fumbling with the cold metal of a worn photograph. It was of his wife, smiling, her eyes bright with a life that seemed impossibly distant now. He traced the outline of her face, a grim resignation settling over him. If he was going to die here, he would die fighting, not waiting for a pronouncement that sealed their doom. He descended the crumbling stairs of the grain elevator, the icy concrete rough beneath his worn boots. The few men who remained under his direct command were gathered in a makeshift command post, a dank cellar that reeked of damp earth and cordite. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes sunken, the very picture of exhaustion and hunger. Yet when Richter spoke, a flicker of something, defiance perhaps, or a desperate rekindled hope, ignited in their weary gazes. "We're going to Sector Gamma," he announced, his voice resonating in the confined space. "Lieutenant Vogel needs us. The Russians are inside the perimeter. We fight them. We find them. And we push them back." A few of the men exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and grim understanding. They had heard the reports, the whispers of the enemy's infiltration. The idea of fighting an enemy they couldn't see, an enemy that could emerge from any shadow, any pile of rubble, was a terrifying prospect. But Richter's steady gaze, his unvarnished honesty, offered a sliver of purpose in the overwhelming uncertainty. "Ammunition is scarce," he continued, his voice unwavering. "But we have our rifles, we have our bayonets, and we have our will to survive. This isn't about holding a fortress anymore. This is about fighting our way out of a trap." He looked at each man in turn, his gaze lingering on Corporal Schmidt, who stood straighter now, his rifle held with a newfound resolve. "We move at first light," Richter declared, his voice ringing with a steely resolve that belied the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. "We move toward Sector Gamma, and we fight." As the men began to prepare, their movements slow and deliberate, Richter found himself staring at a crude map tacked to the cellar wall. It was marked with red X's, representing their positions, and blue X's, representing the enemy's supposed front lines. It was a lie, a pathetic attempt to impose order on the chaos. The blue X's were no longer on the outside. They were scattered throughout the red, a cancerous growth spreading through their defenses. He knew, with a chilling finality, that the battle for Stalingrad had already been lost. The Führer's order was a death sentence, a pronouncement delivered from a world away, ignorant of the icy reality that had already seized them. But for Richter and his men, survival now meant defying that order. It meant fighting not for a fortress, but for their very lives, against an unseen foe that had feasted on their hopes, and was now ready to devour them whole. He picked up his own rifle, the frozen steel biting into his gloved hand, and felt the weight of his responsibility settle upon him, a burden heavier than any greatcoat. The fight for Stalingrad was over. The fight for survival had just begun. The crackle of the radio had died, leaving behind a silence that was more deafening than the phantom roar of artillery. Sergeant Major Klaus Richter stared at the inert handset, the cheap bakelite cool and dead against his gloved palm. Lieutenant Vogel's last, reedy whisper, a chilling prophecy of their own demise, still echoed in the gnawing emptiness of the cellar. They're inside, Sergeant Major, everywhere. Machine gun fire. From our own intersection. We're surrounded. Vogel out. Out. The word hung in the frigid air like a shard of ice, sharp and final. Richter's gaze swept over the huddled figures of his men. Corporal Schmidt, his young face a mask of gaunt exhaustion, shivered uncontrollably, his breath pluming white in the dim lantern light. His eyes, hollowed by hunger and the preternatural dread that had settled over Stalingrad like a shroud, were fixed on Richter. The unspoken question, the primal fear, was etched into every line of his face. What now, Sergeant Major? The Führer's pronouncement, a grand, arrogant decree from a distant throne, felt like a cruel joke now. Fortress Stalingrad! The words themselves seemed to mock the reality of their charnel house. They weren't defending a fortress. They were trapped within a tomb, the enemy already burrowed deep within its foundations, feasting on their hopes. The jagged teeth of shattered buildings gnawed at the gray sky outside, a skeletal monument to their hubris. The wind, a venomous serpent coiled around the ruins, moaned through broken windows, carrying with it the scent of cordite, decay, and the icy breath of the dead. Richter's greatcoat, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a heavy, sodden burden. The rough wool scratched at his neck, a constant reminder of the cold that seeped into his very bones, a cold that mirrored the frost creeping into their souls. He could feel it in the ache of his joints, the stiffness that made every movement a conscious effort. This wasn't just winter. This was a primal force, a relentless enemy in itself, aided and abetted by the enemy within. Schmidt. Richter's voice was a low rasp, rough as the frozen concrete beneath their boots. Gather the men, the ones who can still stand. We move. Schmidt's head snapped up, a flicker of something akin to hope, or perhaps just desperate obedience, in his eyes. He nodded, his gaze darting to the other figures scattered in the gloom. A handful of weary soldiers, their faces etched with the same grim determination, the same gnawing certainty of doom. They were the remnants, the few who hadn't been swallowed by the inferno or the creeping Soviet embrace. Where, Sergeant Major? Schmidt's voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the vastness of their desolation. Richter's jaw tightened. He looked at the map, a tattered, ice-encrusted thing that lay spread on a splintered crate. Sector Gamma. The last transmission had come from there. Lieutenant Vogel, a good officer, a capable man, had been swallowed by the labyrinthine ruins. Sector Gamma, Richter stated, his voice firm, a deliberate counterpoint to the tremor he felt deep within. We go to Sector Gamma. A ripple of unease passed through the assembled men. Sector Gamma. It was a death trap, a known quagmire where the fighting had been thickest, where the enemy had been reported in unprecedented numbers. But the truth, the unvarnished, brutal truth, was that all of Stalingrad was a death trap now. The Führer's imperative to hold was a suicidal command, a pronouncement made from a world away, a world untouched by the biting wind and the gnawing emptiness. Richter rose, his movements stiff. He clapped a hand on Schmidt's shoulder, the boy flinching slightly, not from the force of the blow, but from the sheer, raw desperation that radiated from his superior. "We go to see what happened to Vogel's company? And if the opportunity presents itself?" He paused, the words tasting like ash. "We find a way out. Not a fortress, Schmidt. A way out." The men exchanged glances, a silent, grim understanding passing between them. The preternatural cunning of the Soviets, their ability to weave through the shattered cityscape like ghosts, had turned the vaunted fortress into an abyss. They were not soldiers fighting an external enemy. They were rats trapped in a maze, with the predators already inside. Richter pulled on his thick wool gloves, the leather stiff and unforgiving. He checked the bolt of his rifle, the cold steel a familiar, almost comforting weight in his hands. He looked at the faces of his men, their youth, their weariness, their flicker of defiance. They were all he had, and he, in turn, was all they had. The grand pronouncements of the Führer, the strategic brilliance of the High Command, meant nothing here, buried beneath layers of rubble and ice. Only the immediate, the visceral, the fight for survival mattered. "Listen carefully," Richter began, his voice cutting through the oppressive stillness. "We move in single file. Keep low. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every sound, a trap. We don't engage unless absolutely necessary. Our objective is reconnaissance, and if possible, escape. Understand?" A chorus of muffled "Ja," Sergeant Major answered him. It was a sound devoid of bravado, a sound born of grim resignation. They understood. They had understood for weeks, for months, that the tide had turned, that the icy grip of winter and the relentless pressure of the Soviet forces were not merely tactical challenges, but existential threats. Richter nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible movement. He knew the risks. They were walking into a nest of vipers, a place where the enemy's presence was not a question of if, but when and how. The Soviets weren't just attacking their perimeter. They had bypassed it, infiltrated it, becoming an insidious takeover from within. Their objective was not to breach the fortress walls, but to dismantle it from the inside out. He glanced at the crude map one last time. Sector Gamma, a jumble of streets, buildings, and rubble that had once been a vital part of the city's industrial heart. Now it was a charnel house, a slaughterhouse, a place where the enemy held the keys. The transmission from Lieutenant Vogel had been a desperate plea, a final flickering signal from a lost outpost. "Corporal Schmidt," Richter said, his voice low and steady. "You take the point. Keep your eyes sharp. I'll be right behind you. The rest of you, stay tight. No straggling." Schmidt's breath hitched, but he nodded again, his gaze fixed ahead, as if already scanning the desolate landscape. He was a boy, barely a man, yet he carried the weight of a soldier, the weight of survival. Richter followed Schmidt's silhouette as they emerged from the relative safety of the cellar, stepping out into the biting wind. The world outside was a monochrome canvas of gray sky, white snow, and the skeletal remains of buildings. The air was so cold it burned the lungs, a constant, sharp ache. The silence was broken only by the mournful howl of the wind and the crunch of their boots on the frozen debris. They moved like phantoms through the ruins, their greatcoats blending into the perpetual gloom. Each step was a gamble, each shadow a potential threat. The enemy was not a visible force marching across an open field. They were a creeping, insidious presence, woven into the very fabric of the shattered city. They were the whispers in the ruins, the sudden bursts of fire from unexpected quarters, the gnawing certainty that they were no longer in control of their own fate. Richter felt a primal tension hum beneath his skin, a heightened awareness that bordered on the supernatural. He scanned the shattered facades, the gaping holes that served as windows, the piles of rubble that concealed unseen dangers. The enemy was everywhere, a venomous serpent coiled within the heart of Fortress Stalingrad, and they were walking directly into its gaping maw. The Führer's order to hold echoed in the distance, a hollow pronouncement against the deafening roar of their impending doom. They were not holding a fortress. They were walking into a death trap, and the Soviets were already inside, feasting on their desperate hope. The biting wind, a razor's edge honed on the endless steppes, tore at Richter's greatcoat, a thin shield against the preternatural cold. Snow, fine as powdered bone, swirled in ghostly eddies around their boots, muffling the already muted world. They were a skeletal procession, moving from the relative, if precarious, shelter of the grain elevator's shattered ramparts into the heart of the inferno that had become Stalingrad. The pronouncement from Berlin, the Führer's immutable decree of Festung Stalingrad, echoed in Richter's mind, a chilling finality that tasted like ash. Fortress. The word was a cruel joke, a semantic shroud thrown over a charnel house. They were not defending a fortress. They were trapped within a graveyard, the enemy already burrowed deep within its frozen earth. Corporal Schmidt, his face a gaunt mask of exhaustion, shivered beside Richter, his breath pluming white like a reedy whisper in the oppressive stillness. His eyes, hollowed by hunger and sleeplessness, darted nervously towards the shattered cityscape, a labyrinthine expanse of rubble and ice, where every shadow could conceal a threat. He clutched his rifle, the frozen steel a familiar, cold comfort against his numb fingers. "Sector Gamma, Sergeant Major?" Schmidt's voice was a rough murmur, barely audible above the wind's mournful howl. Richter nodded, the movement stiff and weary. Vogel's transmission was clear. Too clear. "They're not just outside, Schmidt. They're inside." He didn't need to elaborate. The implication hung heavy in the air, a gnawing certainty that chilled him more than the frost. Lieutenant Vogel, a sharp, capable officer, wouldn't have sent such a panicked report unless the situation was beyond dire. The enemy, cunning that bordered on the supernatural, had slipped through their defenses like a venomous serpent coiled within the city's very arteries. Their small detachment, a mere handful of men salvaged from the wreckage of their company, moved with a grim determination. Each step was a victory against the frozen earth, against the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. The odor of cordite and decay, a constant companion in Stalingrad, clung to the air, a morbid perfume of the battlefield. They were not advancing into enemy territory. They were navigating a death trap, a maze where the enemy was already feasting on their hopes. The city, once a proud industrial hub, was now a skeletal monument to destruction. Buildings stood like broken teeth, their windows gaping black sockets. Twisted metal girders, draped in tattered wool and frozen to the ice, resembled monstrous skeletal remains. The snow, which normally brought a deceptive beauty to the landscape, here only served to blanket the ruins, muffling the cacophony of war into a discordant symphony of distant artillery fire and the ever-present chilling wind. Richter scanned the panorama, his steely eyes missing nothing. The vaunted perimeter, so meticulously established, was a phantom. The Soviets, a shadow army, had seeped through the cracks, their insidious takeover complete before Berlin even acknowledged the threat. The arrogance of the pronouncement, Fortress Stalingrad, was a testament to the chasm between the distant strategists and the men who bled and froze on the front lines. They reached a shattered intersection, a nexus of frozen debris and shattered dreams. Here, the wind seemed to whip with a particular ferocity, as if the very air was screaming its despair. Richter signaled a halt, raising a gloved hand. He strained his ears, listening. The muffled sounds of combat, once a constant roar, were now more localized, more terrifyingly intimate. The crackle of small arms fire, the dull thud of explosions. These were the sounds of soldiers fighting not an external enemy, but an unseen foe that had already breached their sanctuary. "Corporal," Richter's voice was low and guttural. "Take 2 men. Scout down that street to the left. Report any enemy movement, any sign of Vogel's men. But do not engage, understand? We are not here to fight a war. We are here to understand how we lost it." Schmidt nodded, his young face set with a grim resolve that belied his years. He chose 2 other soldiers, their greatcoats patched and threadbare, their rifles held with a desperate grip. They moved off, their forms quickly swallowed by the swirling snow and the perpetual gloom. Richter watched them go, a knot of unspoken dread tightening in his gut. He knew the odds. He knew the reality. These men, like himself, were walking into an abyss. He turned his attention back to the main objective. Sector Gamma. Lieutenant Vogel's last transmission had been a desperate plea, a guttural report of being surrounded, of fire coming from the very cellars they had occupied. It spoke of an enemy that had melted into the ruins, appearing and disappearing like phantoms, sowing chaos and despair with surgical precision. "Sergeant Major!" A voice rasped from the rear. It was Private Weber, a grizzled veteran with eyes that had seen too much. The transmission. It sounded like they were fighting us. Not just fighting us, but fighting from us. Richter met Weber's gaze. "That is precisely the problem, Weber. They are inside the fortress, and the fortress, it seems, has no walls." He felt a strange, cold clarity settle over him. The Führer's order was not a directive. It was a death sentence, delivered from a world away, a world that refused to see the icy reality. He looked at the remaining men, their faces etched with fatigue and a dawning horror. They were the remnants, the broken pieces of a once mighty army, now tasked with a mission that defied logic. They were to investigate a disaster that was already a fait accompli. "We move," Richter commanded, his voice cutting through the wind's lament. "Towards Sector Gamma. Keep your eyes open and your mouths shut. We go to see what remains of Vogel's company and what remains of our orders." They advanced, a tight knot of weary defiance against the encroaching darkness. The path ahead was a gauntlet, a treacherous passage through a city that had become a charnel house. The snow crunched underfoot, a sound that was both brittle and hollow, like the last vestiges of hope being ground into the ice. The distant artillery fire seemed to recede, replaced by a more ominous silence, a stillness pregnant with unseen terrors. As they navigated a particularly devastated stretch, a sudden burst of machine gun fire erupted from a bombed-out building to their right. It wasn't the sustained, organized fire of a frontal assault, but a sporadic, almost playful hail of bullets that stitched across the snow-covered ground ahead of them. It was the sound of an unseen enemy, toying with them, tightening the noose. Richter instinctively shoved Corporal Schmidt behind a pile of frozen rubble. "Down!" he roared. The men scrambled for cover, the primal tension humming in their veins. The bullets whizzed past, a chilling reminder of their vulnerability. This was not the front line. This was a massacre waiting to happen. When the firing ceased as abruptly as it began, Richter cautiously peered over the rubble. The street was empty, the building silent once more. It was as if the burst of fire had been a phantom, a trick of the wind and the snow. But they all knew it was real. The Soviets were here, their presence a constant gnawing threat. "They are playing with us," Weber muttered, his voice tight with suppressed fear. Like cats with mice. Richter felt a surge of anger, a hot, defiant spark against the pervasive cold. This was not war. This was annihilation. The Führer's fortress Stalingrad was a death trap, and they were walking willingly into its maw. "We do not play their game," Richter said, his voice steely. "We move. Now, keep low, and keep your eyes on the ground. They are not in the sky. They are in the earth, in the rubble, in the shadows." They continued their agonizing progress. Each yard gained feeling like a victory hard won. The air grew colder, the silence more profound, broken only by the crunch of their boots and the ragged sound of their breathing. The wind howled a mournful dirge, a lament for the lost souls of Stalingrad. As they neared what Richter estimated to be the perimeter of Sector Gamma, a new sound emerged from the gloom, a faint, reedy whistling. It was an eerie,